Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatora, and Rob Runacres from the Renaissance Sword Club. Yeah? So tell us a bit about your club, just briefly. Where are you based?
Well, we're very local actually. We're in Frimley and Camberley, but we've got a branch in London and one in France now. So
really?
Yep.
Who's that running it in France?
Marguerite Lacroix is
cool.
running that. So.
Hi Marguerite, if you're watching this. So where are we? We're at Skirmish, okay? So this is the new event that we're running here in Surrey. And this is the first one we've run. The weather's okay, but there we go. That's April in England, folks. But Rob's been running a rapier class. So we've got a couple of rapiers here. I'll ask you about those in a second. But first of all, tell us a bit about your class. What were you teaching?
Okay, I was basically teaching some stuff from a new translation of this, which is Livre de Leçons. It's original. It's a book of lessons. It's attributed to a guy called Pedro de Heredia. It's from the first half of the 17th century, and it's very confusing because it seems to be a compilation of lessons from the end of the 16th century by a guy called Cavalcabo, who taught Louis XIII. And then it goes right the way through to about 1630, and it's just a mass of information. And I think what most people really want to see is, I'll probably drop this now, things like this.
Don't drop it in the mud.
Are these which are the pictures. We were very lucky, the Swedish Royal Library gave us permission to print the 71 pictures at full colour that come with this book. So I'll just
really hold that up. Stuff. So this is Rob's new book, there we go. Ooh, and we'll put the link below. Is this available on Amazon?
Fallen Rook.
Fallen Rook, okay, so we'll put the link below here. So you've been working on this for a while, I think, haven't you?
Yeah, yeah. I bought the. I managed to get a scan of this from the Scott collection about 8 years ago now, and I kind of
which is in Glasgow.
That's in Glasgow. Yeah. And I really started working on this about 3 years ago because I got an interest in French sword forms. And it's just very intriguing because it's got so many different things in it. It's got Vulgar Destrezza, it's got Italian style, it's got some distinctive French style in it, and just it really fascinated me. And we're really fortunate. Hans Jordlind, good mate of mine, basically managed to get hold of the rights from the Swedish Royal Library to print the pictures from this, and we just thought, great, let's go for it. Keith Farrell was really supportive because it's longer than Fabris. It's a really long treatise. And Enrica Angelini, she's a comic book artist. She worked on some of the interior art and on this, so we've had a lot of people work on this.
That's awesome. So why is this important as a treatise? What's interesting about this particular treatise?
When we look at treatises, I think we generally look at them as a statement of a single person's life work. And because we're HEMA people, we tend to act as they're sort of this interesting thing from the past. And we apply our modern views on it. This is a living, breathing treatise that was compiled over 30 years. It's got different people working on it. And for them, it wasn't just about imparting a life lesson. This is what they found interesting and was useful for them in something that was very real at the time. And because of that, it's kind of like a living, breathing document which has a lot of problems and discrepancies in it as people are trying to think through things. And for me, that's fascinating rather than, looking at something in this kind of encapsulated bubble of the past.
Is there anything particular about this system which stands in contrast to Fabris, for example?
It's very difficult to say because it's compilation. What I would say, as opposed to Fabris, is that when you look at the 1606 Fabris, it's very much for Christian IV, for his patron, so it's a very elegant Renaissance thing. This is Vulgar Destrezza and seems to be a compilation of perhaps more aggressive techniques in some ways, but also you got Cavalcabo at the beginning, the section by him, who is teaching at court. It does have one thing that's particularly interesting, which is the lunge. The lunge is previously, this particular lunge is only used by Francois d'Ancy in 1623.
Which is another source you've worked with.
Indeed, quite a bit, yeah. And who's writing it probably in the middle of this. And it may be the earliest indication of what is later termed the Italian lunge by the later Destrezza authors, when they're trying to counter this in the 1680s and beyond. And Marcelli used this in 1683. And this particular lunge is with a dagger and involves throwing the arm back with the dagger arm whilst making this, so you're not actually covering with it. And there's a lot of counters to this technique. So This
So
actually
it
shows-
goes back
absolutely, and the dagger
like
is actually past there, so it's being
Right.
thrown back, and you're completely in profile.
right.
And
Is that to
this
gain
really-
range, to gain distance, or is that balance? Or
Good question.
Right.
Balance, being in profile, who knows?
Right.
The Spanish readily dismiss it. There's a lot of counters to it in here, but more importantly, it is seen much later in Italy. So is this something that is developing in France or the lowlands and is then transmuted down? I think some of my Italian friends would probably want to disagree. They'd want to see their lunge as their lunge. So that in particular has got it. But it's also just the massive material. It's just
Right.
Dave Rawlins did a very nice review on this, and he rightly pointed out that you can basically pick up a section and you've got your lesson plan there, and it goes through in a really methodical way. You do this and then you do a slight variation and move all the way through.
So, would you call it? Is this Destrezza? Is it?
As a historian, I'd have to say, well, it's an interesting idea, but more research is needed. It's a form of Vulgar Destrezza. You see some
Okay.
Spanish terms in there that have been Gallicised, turned into sort of a French text, because it's originally written in French. It does seem to be a Spaniard perhaps put together some of this, because there's a lot of Spanish forms that are trying to be thrust onto the Italian and don't quite sit right. So it is, I'd say, a Vulgar Destrezza. It talks about fighting the mathematical forms. It talks about fighting Destrezza.
So just
So
to
it's
interject there, because I think a lot of people watching this will be like, "What's Destrezza?"
Yeah.
So as a non, basically as a non-rapierist, but also as a non-Destrezza person, my understanding is the word Destrezza means skill or
Yes.
something like that, right?
Yep.
So, but more specifically than that, Destrezza came to mean a specific school of thought.
Exactly.
Applied to-
Destrezza starts with Carranza in the 16th century, and is developed as part of a philosophy and Euclidean mathematics and so on. I have to say Noble Destrezza starts with him,
Right.
and it's very much how it becomes part of the courtly etiquette, and it becomes the truth, as far as I call it. A lot of them, and it's very much the noble form, and they reject the common form, which a lot of the soldiers are using,
Which is what
or
you
the
call
Italian-
vulgar
Yeah,
Destrezza.
they called it vulgar, but they mean it in a common sense.
Yeah.
And then you get people like Pacheco who's slightly more aggressive with it, and then it starts to come by the end of Spanish Destrezza when you get people like Rada in the early 18th century using a little bit of vulgar forms, maybe got a bit of a lunge in there, and then what happens is you get the French Bourbon aristocracy take over Spain after the War of the Spanish Succession. And you start to get the small sword becoming more popular at court. So
Right.
that starts to go the way of things. But you've got Noble Destrezza is your high form, and then this, which has components of Vulgar Destrezza in.
So you talked about starting to use the lunge. So was the lunge not used in Noble Destrezza?
Arguably no.
Okay.
Arguably no.
So how do you reach the target?
You step. I
Okay.
think if Tom Puey watches this, please don't kill me, Tom, because I know you know this better. All right, but yeah. So essentially, that's more to do with moving inwards and controlling the blade and coming in.
So with obtaining a bind
Yeah.
and gathering in to
Yes.
a point at which you can deliver a thrust.
Exactly. So should
Right.
I just put this down and we have a little play?
Yeah.
So if we can stand, and if you stick your arm out so straight,
Yeah.
like this, and turn it over, okay. Pillions up. Okay. A lot of it starts here. Okay.
Okay.
And you do a lot with the binding and the stepping and so on like this. Let's come back in so people can see. That's how the Spanish will do this. Whereas so they're using basically displacement and moving around in a circle. You are in profile more
Right.
and so on like this. Gérard Thibault d'Anvers does exactly the same thing. He has a form of what might call mathematical form or Noble Destrezza. The Italians, they use a slightly different approach, which is through measure and tempo. They have a different philosophy in doing it. I should say as well that Noble Destrezza is not necessarily for defence. It's got far more to it than that. It's got a whole layer of things, much as most sword forms are not purely for defence.
Right.
So, but what I'm doing is very, very vulgar.
Right. So we've got Noble Destrezza, Vulgar Destrezza, and whilst these are generally Spanish, they did of course affect swordsmanship in other places. We know there were people teaching Spanish forms in England, the Netherlands, which was under Spanish control,
Yep.
southern Italy, Naples, Kingdom of Naples.
It's a very good and long conversation, because we see Carranza certainly knows of the Bolognese form, and at one point Rome, the quarter of the population is Spanish, So there must be some sort of transhumance of ideas. You've also got Destreza India, of course, which affects some of the Eastern martial arts that are going out there. So it is perhaps more widespread, but as it reaches its epoch, it's quite insular in some ways. It is very divergent from what we might call the Italian form that you see elsewhere. But again, this may be a challenge for the modern HEMA historian to not be too pigeonholing in what they're seeing. There may not be quite as hard a definition between them as you know, as they may not have been quite so much of a definition in the past as we see today. We have to be really careful with this sort of thing.
And I think some of my viewers on this channel will be interested in the Zorro element, I'll call it. In that definitely Spanish schools of swordsmanship were obviously influential in Latin America.
Yes.
And even as late as the 19th century, there's sabre treatises which use Destreza principles or try to apply to them to sabre, which is completely different to the other sabre material at the time, and it's very interesting.
Who I mentioned, who has got these huge volumes of fantastic stuff, and one day I hope someone will translate it. He was in Spanish America,
right.
So he's actually there. I believe he was one of the governor, and he was going out and fighting people and applying these techniques. So he's actually a man in the Spanish Empire who's writing a Noble Destreza tract.
Right. No, it's fascinating stuff. Right. So something else I want to briefly ask about. So some of you may have noticed this particular style of rapier, which I would probably partly in my ignorance describe as a Spanish style rapier, but there are certain characteristics which I think, and not to say that all Spanish rapiers are like this. You do find Spanish swept hilts and Spanish small swords and so on, but this type of rapier is very associated with Spanish fencing, isn't it? And the general, I mean, you've got a cup hilt, and this is more a form of cup sort of shell hilt, isn't it? But they usually have very long quillons and quite a short grip, and a knuckle bow and quite thrusty centric blades.
Yes, now that
but not always.
No, not always.
I know some do have broader blades.
So this is this made by Ferrum Armories, and it's basically the Spanish imperial measurements. So what happens is you got Pacheco, this guy comes in who's not a nice guy, and he basically wants to be the top master of fencing and he gets to be this, so he's at court and so on, and the Spanish court starts to define the measurements, and this is the imperial measurement. This is basically how the king, you had to have, if you're a noble, you had to have your sword like this.
Right.
And so it has basic attributes. It's a lot shorter than the Italian blade. So for us, it's up to about 41, 42 inches from the cross piece.
Which is not so long for a rapier. Many rapiers are 45 and even more inches.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Short grip, it would use basically a two-finger grip, but I tend to hold it a little more like a paintbrush, in like so.
So two fingers over the over the guard.
A lot of people grip quite hard, but you need to try and hold it lightly, and this allows you to move the grip underneath the wrist.
And so I've now realised why it's such a short grip, because if you've got two fingers above the guard, half your hand is basically inside that cup, and you don't need as much grip behind.
You don't actually have to have your fingers through the ring. You can hold it on top like so.
Right.
And it also assists in cutting. Now, in the Spanish form, they use a lot of cutting. It's one of the great misnomers. I think you've done an episode about it, how you use a rapier for cutting.
Yeah.
And so when you're dealing with pressure on the blade, you would often do a cut around it. So this one is a rapera de concha, a conch hilt. It's very stylized.
Like a conch shell. Yeah.
Exactly. It's kind of a mishmash. It's made by Liad Martinez, who's a lovely guy in Spain. I'm afraid to say that I'm using a Sport 7 blade, which is a bit sporty. The reason being is a lot of blades we find in rapier are quite floppy, whereas with a triangular blade, you can actually get a nice flex and also get a bind. Ferrum I'm very pleased to say, have come up with a really good bind in their blade. So these are the sort of weapons that they would have used about the time.
Fantastic. Okay, great. One thing I want to ask you about is your YouTube project.
Yes.
So Alta Heron is your channel. So tell us about what is that?
Alta Heron was basically set up with a guy called Hans Jodlind. Hi Hans. We're old mates, and we were kind of described as the two old Muppets from the Muppet Show, are always complaining about, oh, it should be done like this. We decided to actually do a channel together as a magazine for HEMA people. And really what we tried to do was show behind the scenes of a lot of things. We wanted to go out and actually say, okay, well, this is what, if you've got an event, everyone sort of looks at the competitors or they look at the main people teaching there, and that's great, but who are the people who set it up? So we started off with that, and then we wanted to really talk about some of the in-depth things in HEMA. So and we've been trying to get you on it for ages, and you always evade us. And so we've got people like Tom Pui talking about Destreza, for example, giving a little more in-depth than you would do in an introductory show. We've had like Jake Norwood talking about the American scene and some of the challenges that are out there. We do, event reviews and so on, and a lot of in-depth stuff.
And like you say, it is very in-depth, and it's really it's a HEMA channel for HEMA people, I think, and it's if you are a HEMA person out there, or just if you want to get a little bit deeper into the subject and see some of the things that people who are really deep into the scene are talking about and thinking about, I highly recommend you watch Altair, and so of course there'll be a link to the channel below this video. So finally, your book was out recently, wasn't it? Or about a month ago, something like that?
A couple of months ago now.
Yeah. And so link below if you want to learn a bit more about this fantastic book and system, and Pedro de Heredia, or attributed to him, but compilation. So it's fascinating stuff. Thank you very much, Rob, for coming to teach at Skirmish.
1 minute, actually. Ooh. I think there is one thing. Have been a little bit concerned about your knowledge of the rapier, so I thought maybe if you took this and kept it,
thank you very much. Well, do you know what's good? This can now feature in more videos because I can show. But it's one thing actually. Just before we sign off, you noted that he doesn't do double rapier. So a lot of people on my channel want to know all about double wielding, and you'll see that they're double wielding rapiers. Case of rapiers was a thing, was absolutely a thing, and that there are examples that survive. So by case of rapiers, it means a matching pair of rapiers that are clearly for left and right hand, and it's shown on here, but it's not in the book. What's that all about?
Right, well, the pictures were done after the treatise was written.
Right.
Now, I've got a theory, which is pretty baseless, but these were actually a lot larger, these pictures, and I think they were for demonstration. They were for very high status people. There is a possibility these are linked to Gaston d'Orléans, who was the brother of Louis XIII, who was in Brussels at the time this was being compiled. Now, the case of rapiers shown maybe just there as basically to have some sort of emblem underneath as a frontispiece to recover, or it may be that we don't have the entire treatise, and these were done for part of the treatise that were there. But these pictures, highly ornamental, huge amount of effort and work got into them, and I really do feel it's for someone quite high status.
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. This is there's been no expense spared on this art, has there at all? It's a beautiful thing. Well, thank you very much, Rob. Hopefully also we'll be able to, we don't live far away from each other, so hopefully we'll be able to meet up, because I think there's some specific questions it would be really interesting to go into a little bit more depth on. Anytime. About rapiers in general, but also Spanish, Italian, French systems that were intermingling and interacting with each other in Europe at that time. And it's, as I'm very clear to point out on my channel, it is absolutely not my period or weapon of very much knowledge at all yet. Although I am finding myself fencing with rapier more these days. So yeah, I'm sure I can learn a lot from that. Right, so thank you for watching, folks. Go and buy Rob's book right now. And also check out Alta Heron with Rob and Hans. And hi Hans, and hi Marguerite and the other people we've mentioned. Thanks a lot, Rob.
Thanks for your time.
Cheers.
Cheers, Matt.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.